Welcome to GRE. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. The Fed keeps escalating their quiet war against the middle class. I'm talking about it with one of the most influential financial figures of the past century today. Also, what the recent FTC decision on rents means to real estate on Get Rich Education.
Since 2014, the powerful Get Rich Education podcast has created more passive income for people than nearly any other show in the world. This show teaches you how to earn strong returns from passive real estate investing in the best markets without losing your time being a flipper or landlord. Show host Keith Weinhold writes for both Forbes and Rich Dad Advisors and delivers a new show every week. Since 2014, there's been millions of listener downloads in 188 world nations. He has A-list show guests include top-selling personal finance author Robert Kiyosaki. Get Rich Education can be heard on every podcast platform, plus it has its own dedicated Apple and Android listener phone apps. Build wealth on the go with the Get Rich Education podcast. Sign up now for the Get Rich Education podcast or visit GetRichEducation.com.
You're listening to the show that has created more financial freedom than nearly any show in the world. This is Get Rich Education.
Welcome to GRE. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Let's get right into it, as there's a lot to cover here on our last big show before Christmas. Briefly, before we get to the Fed's quiet war against the middle class, the Federal Trade Commission just fired off a warning shot to landlords. And here's the translation about what this means to you. Advertise your real all-in rent amount with mandatory fees included in that amount, or expect company. And by company, the FTC means attorneys, paperwork, and a long headache. And I'll tell you why I think this is a good thing. But really, first, what this is all about is that it stems from the antecedent settlement with the massive global real estate company Greystar about transparent pricing. You might know that Greystar is the massive global real estate company. They specialize in rental housing. In fact, Greystar is the largest apartment operator in the entire U.S. They're in about 250 markets. The FTC cracked down on Greystar's add-on fees, those fees added on to the rent amount that aren't clear and transparent right from the beginning. Now, in their case, it's things like package concierge charges, valet trash service fees, and some of these other line items that magically appear after a renter has already emotionally moved into a unit. Now, for your rentals, they might be other things like pest control fees, gym fees, pet fees, utility add-ons. And notice that I use the word might because clarification is still being sought here. But suffice to say, the least that you should know is really three things. Advertise a rental price that excludes mandatory charges, and that could be a violation of the law. So then state the total cost of renting the unit up front. No fine print gymnastics. Secondly, do a compliance check. You need to review your ads to confirm that they honestly convey your rental unit's price. That includes working with third-party marketing vendors like Zillow or Facebook Marketplace to see if they accurately state the all-in price, because if they understate the price, it's still your problem. And thirdly, know that the FTC is reviewing harmful practices in the rental housing market. They'll take action against landlords that try to hide mandatory fees. So no hide and seek. And the FTC resource is in our show notes, and I sent it to you in last week's newsletter as well if you want to read it all. My take here is that this type of transparency is a good thing. I mean, come on. We all know how annoying it is if, say, an airline states like, hey, we've got prices to this destination. You can fly there for as low as $200. Yeah, but what if it's a 28-hour 4-layover journey to fly 300 miles? Okay. What about buying an event ticket to go to a music concert and say you've already got 10 minutes wrapped up in this, but they don't show you the final price with all the fees, until you've already invested that 10 minutes and then you learn about this in your shopping cart. So that type of thing is deceptive. All right, well, what this FTC case does is it eliminates that effect in the rental housing market. So if you're a landlord, your competitors shouldn't be able to advertise base rents minus fees against your unit that appears higher priced than it's really not. And then for renters, the clarity helps expedite their search process. So this lets good assets compete on real value, and that is good business. Now, as far as the Fed controlling the economy, Jerome Powell announced interest rate cuts both last year and some more again this year. And though the effect isn't immediate, mortgage rates do come down with them. Mortgage rates have also fallen this year because the yield spread premium is lower. And you know what the prevailing sentiment is among a lot of armchair economists? It is squarely this: you ain't seen nothing for cuts yet. People say, oh, watch, once Trump gets his guy in there in May, meaning that's when the newly appointed Fed chair is in power, oh, you're really going to see some giant rate cuts then. Yeah, a lot of people talk about this like it's certainly coming. They say then the Fed funds rate is going to go way down, meaning mortgage rates are then going to go way down, meaning that home prices are therefore going to soar next year. Well, all of that could happen, but it is nowhere close to the certainty camp for everything to respond exactly that way. As you know, as a listener here, paradoxically, mortgage rates have little to do with home prices. Look at history over hunches. In fact, it might be more likely that those things don't happen and don't all break exactly that way than the probability that they do. And that quickly gets into conjecture territory. As we know, lowering rates is bad too because it signals that a weak economy needs the help typically. What could be different this next time? Well, whether we're in a good or a bad economy, Trump still wants lower rates, and he really imposes his will on the situation. We're about to bring in the author of a new book called The Preparation. It's about preparing for the economic future. A lot of the book is mostly for young men and their parents, but we'll speak to both females and males today. Is the middle class both worse off and, in a way, better off today than they were a generation or two ago? Talk to your grandparents. They didn't pay for a college education. They didn't get one. They rarely ate out at restaurants. They didn't have a smartphone, which is now practically mandatory to even exist. Today, people are paying for all of that, so no wonder that prospective first-time homebuyers almost seem to be going extinct. Let's meet this week's guest. Are we going to get a painful financial reset in the form of runaway inflation, a market crash, or something else? We'll answer that before we're done today. The Fed is engaged in a quiet war against the middle class. They are going to create trillions more fiat dollars to lower interest rates further and create inflation. That's according to today's guest. He is the international man himself, a legendary and generationally popular author, and he does a lot more than that. He's back with us for a sobering look at this today. Hey, welcome in, Doug Casey.
Thanks, Keith. It's nice to be here with you, although here for me is in Buenos Aires, Argentina, where I spend a good part of the year.
Such a nice place, good year-round weather there. A piece you recently wrote is titled The Fed's Quiet War Against the Middle Class. The Fed recently announced that they're stopping QT, which basically means they're stopping the destruction of dollars and opening the floodgates to print dollars. You've been known to say that the level of interest rates is the most important single indicator of an economy, and the Fed has made several quarter-point cuts over the last year plus. Although the president is supposed to stay independent of Fed influence, oh my gosh, he has been more vocal than any other president ever over how badly he wants low rates. What are your thoughts with regard to all this, Doug?
Well, the Fed, which most people have been taught to believe is part of the cosmic firmament.
Right.
It should be abolished. It serves no useful purpose. The Fed is an engine of inflation. It's what creates Federal Reserve notes. It's an engine of inflation and purely destructive, and it's used by the government to finance itself. So that's the first thing I've got to say. And they don't know what interest rates should be. Neither does Trump. Neither does anybody else. That's for the market to determine.
Right.
And interest rates are set by the amount of savings that's done by the people and the amount of borrowing that's done by other people. The problem is, with the Fed printing up lots and lots of money, which they are through the banking system, it makes it rather foolish to be a saver. In other words, if you produce more than you consume, which is something everybody should do, you want to save the difference. That's how you become wealthy. But if they destroy the currency with inflation, it's pointless to save. And if there's no savings, there's no capital to lend. This is why we're sliding off a slippery slope in the direction of a third world country, where there's no savings, where the money's no good. It's a real problem. I think the average American, despite increases in technology that we've benefited from over many years, the average American has found his standard of living go down a lot. And it's basically because of the destruction of the currency that makes it impossible for him to save and get ahead of things, and results in wild and crazy moves in the stock markets and the real estate markets and the interest rate markets, where things become unpredictable. So everybody's being turned into a speculator, whether they like it or not. And frankly, we're headed towards a real reckoning in the U.S. and in the world generally. So my approach at this point is to hold on to your hat, because we're in for rough running in the years to come.
To create low rates, the Fed basically needs to create trillions of new fiat dollars. Tell us about how that works.
Well, it's a question of the supply and demand of money. You've got two things happening. Number one, when the Fed has quantitative easing, as they call it, which basically means inflating the dollar.
Yeah.
Quantitative easing, or QE, is just a nice word for inflating the dollar. They're increasing the supply of dollars out there. You increase the supply of dollars, the price of money goes down in the short run. But in the long run, the value of the dollar also goes down. And nobody's going to lend money if they can't get more in interest than it's being depreciated at. So you've got these two forces fighting against each other, making for an unstable system. That's why I say that, look, before 1933, when Roosevelt took gold out of the dollar, or in fact, before 1913, when the Federal Reserve was created, before that, there was no central bank. There was no Federal Reserve in the U.S. Money was just a medium of exchange and a store of value. It wasn't a political commodity, which it is now. Today, everybody's looking at the government to do something, to make a decision, to raise rates. Some people want them higher, or lower them. Some people want them lower. But this is for the market to decide. It shouldn't be a political decision.
Low rates, which most think are coming, produce an inflationary environment, which then means that longer term, there need to be new higher rates in order to combat that.
Well, what we've got is a situation where conflicting advice and beliefs are causing rates, and indeed most of the economy, to go up and down like an elevator with a lunatic at the controls. And actually, that's a very good analogy.
And low rates, to your earlier point, Doug, they don't encourage anyone to save. And you know what? Government policy doesn't encourage anyone to save either. In times of crisis, like look what happened during COVID. Oh my gosh, if these people can't go to work and generate an income, they don't have any savings, obviously. So then let's go ahead and intervene even more and send them stimulus checks, basically a bailout. So low rates discourage anyone from saving, but so does our policy, because every time there's a big catastrophe, they just come in with a safety net anyway. That's part of the reason why we have such a problem with capital formation of the average American today.
Well, it's actually worse than that because over generations, a lot of debt has built up in the country. In other words, to maintain your standard of living, a lot of people have borrowed. They've done this either by taking the savings of past generations and borrowing it, or mortgaging their personal futures. Either way, look, if you and I went out and borrowed $1 million today, we could raise our standard of living artificially for the next year. But at the end of that year, we have to pay back the $1 million plus interest. And that artificial rise in our standard of living will result in a very real decline in our standard of living. And a great deal of the borrowing that's been done to stimulate the economy through the banking system is for consumption, not for production. In other words, a lot of the borrowing is not to create new technologies and new infrastructure and new capital goods to create more wealth. A lot of it's just stuff that you wind up, people are borrowing things to fill their basements and their garages with more junk. Consumer borrowing for vacations, borrowing to go to music shows, all kinds of things. This has become a habit in the U.S.
Right.
So it's going to end very badly. It's going to end, and is ending as we speak, actually, in what I call the Greater Depression. It's going to be what we're looking at here, largely because of monetary manipulation, but also because taxes have gone up, from zero level, basically in 1913. There were no income taxes in the U.S. The U.S. government lived exclusively on minimal tariffs and excise duties. But today there's, and they're very high, high levels of inflation, high levels of borrowing. So I think we're coming to the end of the road as far as that's concerned. And it's bad news. Of course, most of the real wealth in the world, when you have a financial collapse, when you have a depression, most of the real wealth still exists. It just changes ownership. That's all. So you want to position yourself so that you're not too adversely affected by what's coming.
This inflation and more coming inflation, pumping up the asset values of the asset owners and then ruining the lifestyles of those in the lower middle class and making them trend down lower since they spend a greater proportion of their income on everyday needs like clothing and food, which is a small proportion of people that are well off, and the poor don't have the assets to benefit from that inflation. And Doug, it wasn't until I read your recent article that I realized something, that initially the Fed only had one mandate, price stability. And then later, they added that maximum employment was their second mandate. I didn't realize that. So really, it's been an expansion of what they're paying attention to and a de facto expansion of their powers and influence and control.
Well, actually, they have a third mandate now, which is to control long-term interest rates, to prop up the mortgage market, to prop up the real estate market. Because, as you know, the real estate market floats on a sea of debt. And if you can't get a mortgage, if you can't borrow, you can't buy real estate, or for that matter, you can't sell it. So this makes it a very unstable situation. And most people are unaware of the fact that before the last depression, the longest mortgage you could get was 5 years, and that was with a 20% down payment. So things have changed a lot since then. And the more debt you use to finance anything, the more unstable things become. And the fact that things have become so unstable and the average guy's standard of living has been sinking, and he has more credit card debt, more mortgage debt, more automobile debt. Used to be you paid cash for a car, then it was financed for 2 years, then 5, then 7, and then it was leased where you never even owned it. I mean, this is a trend that's coming to an end at this point. So it's going to be quite a comeuppance for people, I think.
Long-term financing and the easing of getting financing makes the cost of anything higher. There's probably no greater example than that of what has happened with college tuition over the decades. But, Doug, when we talk about this centrally planned economy, rather than letting free market forces take over, I love it. I just absolutely love it when the answer to a problem is actually doing less than what you're currently doing. Let go of the reins. Rather than the Fed controlling interest rates, if there were a free market doing it, you would have bank loan rates that couldn't become too high, or else they wouldn't attract borrowers. So rates would naturally fall. And then you also couldn't have bank loan rates that are too low because you've got to compensate the bank for bad borrower risk. So rates would come up and they would find some natural level, kind of to the point that you made earlier. There would be a natural set point, price discovery. That's how I think of a free market working for interest rates rather than announcements by a Fed chair.
Well, you're right. The problem is that the high government officials, the elite, if you would, think they know best and are trying to manipulate things, but they don't know best, quite frankly. And one other comment that you made, which I think is very appropriate, is college tuitions. For years, I've recommended that young people forget about college. It's a huge misallocation of your time and money. You wind up studying things, well, after you are through partying and drinking and chasing the opposite sex, and the things you learn about have no practical application in the world. And I'm not talking about learning history and the classics and mathematics and science. Okay, those are valuable things. Most of what people are taking in college today are hobby subjects, if you would, or things that are fun to learn in your spare time, but you shouldn't burden yourself with a lifetime of debt to do those things and get a worthless degree. Everybody has a degree. And with great inflation, they're a waste of time. That's why I wrote this book with Matt Smith, who's my podcast. It's called The Preparation. It's on Amazon, and it explains, talking about your standard of living, which is what this is all about, really, why it's foolish to go to college today, and exactly what, especially a young man, should do instead of misallocating the four most valuable, vibrant years of his life sitting behind a desk listening to Marxist-leaning professors corrupt you with all kinds of really bad ideas. So that's why we wrote The Preparation. And it tells young men exactly what they should do instead of burdening themselves under hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, which can't be discharged and serves no useful purpose, what they've learned in exchange for it. So, I mean, this is one of the things that people should be doing, but not enough are.
And AI changes things fast. I mean, for a 4-year college graduate today, what you learned as a freshman 3 or 4 years ago could quickly be outdated, and that effect just wasn't nearly as great as it was a few decades ago. But if you're listening in the audio only, Doug just held up his book called The Preparation, which he co-authored with Matthew Smith. If this way of thinking resonates with you, here's some actionable things that you can actually do. You're listening to Get Rich Education. Our guest is international man Doug Casey. More when we come back. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Most people think they're playing it safe with their liquid money, but they're actually losing. Savings accounts and bonds don't keep up when true inflation eats 6 or 7% of your wealth every single year. I invest my liquidity with FFI, Freedom Family Investments, in their flagship program. Why? Fixed 10 to 12% returns have been predictable and paid quarterly. There's real-world security backed by needs-based real estate like affordable housing, senior living, and healthcare. Ask about the Freedom Flagship Program when you speak to a Freedom Coach there. And that's just one part of their family of products. They've got workshops, webinars, and seminars designed to educate you before you invest. Start with as little as $25K and finally get your money working as hard as you do. Get started at freedomfamilyinvestments.com/GRE or send a text now. It's 1-937-795-8989. Yep, text their Freedom Coach directly. Again, 1-937-795-8989. The same place where I get my own mortgage loans is where you can get yours, Ridge Lending Group, NMLS 42056. They provided our listeners with more loans than anyone because they specialize in income properties. They help you build a long-term plan for growing your real estate empire with leverage. Start your pre-qual and even chat with President Chaley Ridge personally. While it's on your mind, start at ridgelendinggroup.com. That's ridgelendinggroup.com.
Hey everybody, it's Robert Helms of the Real Estate Guys radio program. So glad you found Keith Weinhold and Get Rich Education. Don't quit your daydream.
Welcome back to Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. We're talking with Doug Casey about how the Fed is quietly intervening and hollowing out the middle class. When it comes to interest rates, since you state about them being the most important indicator for an economy, I think a lot of people don't realize, Doug, and maybe you run into this too, that interest rates are not high today. I mean, on the long run, the Fed funds rate averages 4.6%, and today it's in the high threes. So they're not actually high today, but with all these crises where we had all this money printing and these low rates, they feel high, but they're not.
Well, you're quite correct. The question is at what rate is the dollar losing value? The official U.S. government figures say, well, I don't know what they say. They vary, and the numbers are jumbled. And I think the general price level in the U.S., if we were realistic, is going up well over 5%, probably closer to 10%.
You can make that case, yeah.
I think so, because I'm talking to you now from Argentina. And for years, the figures were notoriously and outrageously concocted, made up to make people think things weren't as bad as they are. And here in Argentina, we've just had a revolution, actually, a peaceful revolution with replacing the Peronist government with a man named Javier Milei. It's probably the most unusual and most important election, believe it or not, in world history, because Milei was elected here in Argentina on the platform of basically getting rid of the government, disbanding it. In other words, Elon Musk's Doge, but on steroids, times 10. And things have gotten a lot better here because of that. And it's too bad that Doge has been eliminated in the U.S. because a lot of people don't understand that the government doesn't really produce anything at all. All it does is take taxes from you and pass that money around to other people with a lot skimmed off the top to do things that entrepreneurs would probably, or certainly I'd say, do by themselves. And they make it worse by printing up money to give to people to do those things and borrowing money, which acts as an albatross around everybody's neck. So I'd make the case that I'm not promoting either the Republicans or the Democrats. I'd kind of say a pox on both their houses. They're just two sides of the same coin. What I think we ought to have is a much smaller, much smaller government. But are we going to get one? No, we're not getting it right now because I think a lot of people aren't aware of the fact that the government is running $2 trillion, $3 trillion per year deficits. And those deficits are going up, not down. So where's that money coming from? Well, most of it's being created out of thin air. It's being inflated through the banking system. So the prognosis is not terribly good. Now, along the way, of course, people have hid in real estate, made a lot of money in real estate. Real estate prices have gone up faster than retail inflation's gone up.
Yeah.
But I'm asking myself whether it's not possible that the real estate market could come unglued at this point because it floats on a sea of debt. What do you think, Keith? Do you have any fears about that?
Homeowners are in great shape today. They have record equity positions. They're not going to walk away. Many of them are still locked into these really low mortgage rates, so they're in really good shape. This is something very different from the 2008 global financial crisis when you had irresponsible borrowers that had negative equity positions and an oversupply of housing so they could move out and get something cheaper. Today, if you move out in the great situation that you're in with your low mortgage rate and a high equity position, you'd lose your high equity position and you might have to go pay rent that's higher somewhere else. So I don't see a lot of real estate appreciation coming over the next year or two, but I don't see any impending crash, largely due to that condition. There's not distress in the market.
Are you worried about the fact that most local and state governments are on the ragged edge of insolvency and might be raising their real estate taxes? And of course, insurance costs seem to be going up a lot faster than most other costs as well. Right now, utility costs are relatively low because oil and gas prices are low, but that could change too. I mean, is there anything that could take the real estate train off the rails?
Not that I see. In fact, real estate values have only fallen substantially one time since World War II, and that was during the 2008 global financial crisis when we had conditions that are largely the opposite today. That's back when we had an oversupply and an irresponsible borrower that had negative equity, so they wanted to walk away, and that created the down drain. To your point, yes, I do see property taxes continuing to increase, but because values aren't increasing as much, they would have to increase the mill rate to get further increases. And then most of the big insurance increases, many feel they are done. They had to come up because with inflation, the replacement cost of a property, if you would have a loss, rose and increased that way. So because we're still supply challenged in a lot of places, I see prices holding up, but not appreciating like 10% anytime soon. And that's due to an affordability constraint. I don't see how they could possibly do that. And when we talk about that average person, Doug, that person trying to make their mortgage payments or their rent payments, I was talking on a recent episode about the K-shaped economy. I think it's something that we often visualize in our mind. You see the upper branch of the K rising, the lower branch of the K falling, which is emblematic of this hollowing out of the middle class. But I recently saw it graphically represented where you have the capital share of income going up for people over the decades. That used to be 50-50 between capital share of income and labor share of income. Back 60 years ago, it was 50-50. But now with this K-shaped divergence, one's capital share of income is about 57% today, and their labor share of income is only about 43% today. And it's kind of sad. I sort of hate to say it out loud, but it's like hard work just does not pay off like it used to. Much of this due to inflation pumping up asset values.
Well, I understand what you're saying, and I think you're correct because, there's an old saw. They say the rich get richer while the poor get poorer. And that's kind of what this K-shaped economy is telling us. You've got the super rich in the top 1% or 1/10 of 1% that are becoming ultra double wealthy. And the guy at the bottom, well, his Social Security taxes have risen from almost nothing to 15% of his wages. And it's a real problem. And it's said that the members of Gen Z can't afford to buy a house today as well. So what do you do about this? Well, my suggestion is, if possible, you don't want to get a job working for somebody else. If at all possible, you've got to work for yourself as an entrepreneur. That's the first thing. It's very hard to get wealthy working for somebody else.
Sure.
The best way is to work for yourself. But in order to do that, you have to train yourself with lots of skills and lots of knowledge. And I'm not sure if people are doing that to the degree they ought to either. So I don't know how this is going to end. And of course, you mentioned earlier artificial intelligence, and robotics are tied up hand in glove with artificial intelligence. It's clear that within 5 years, we'll have robots that may not look entirely like people, but can do almost anything that a human being can do. And this is going to put a lot of pressure on people that don't have special skills, especially with artificial intelligence being programmed into these super competent robots. So the whole world is changing right before our very eyes right now.
When we talk about the middle class struggle, I probably follow the housing market more closely than you do. The NAR recently gave us the latest statistic. 2 years ago, the average age of the first-time home buyer was age 35. Last year, it rose to 38. This year, it's now 40, just the average age of the first-time home buyer. So in high-cost areas, that could very well be 45. I mean, people are getting gray hair before they make a down payment for this middle class that's trying to get into the ownership class.
And the further back you go, the younger the age
Right.
that people were buying houses at. So, I mean, it used to be people would try to buy a house right out of school, frankly. But that's out of the question today.
Yeah, I sure don't remember those days myself, but yeah, it sure was substantially younger just a couple decades ago. Well, Doug, where are we going with all this? I mean, does a reset eventually happen with either runaway inflation? Do you think that happens first, or some sort of market crash, or is it something else? I mean, what cataclysmic act is likely to happen first?
Well, look, I hate to be too gloom and doomy because everybody, first of all, generally speaking, trends in motion stay in motion, and everything has been maybe gradually descending standard of living wise, but the economy's held together and we haven't had any catastrophic collapse. Well, almost did in 2008 and a couple other times. But I think we're headed for one. So what should you do about it? I would say consume less if you possibly can and save what you can. If possible, take a second job while it's still possible to go out and get a second job, or found an entrepreneurial activity so that if you lose your job, you've got a backup system. But with the changes in technology, and of course, what's happening in robotics and AI are just part of it. You're not going to be able to rely on what you relied on in the past because the world is changing very, very radically. As far as real estate's concerned, look, I actually own a lot of real estate, but, I've come to the conclusion that at this point, I want to treat my house and other real estate basically as not so much as an investment to make money, but
To store value.
that's right, a store of value where I can put some capital aside. I don't want to keep a lot of money in dollars. That doesn't mean I want debt either. That's risky. For many, many years, I've advocated and bought gold and silver because they are money in its most basic form. And it's worked out really well. I started buying gold at about $40. It's at about $4,000 today. And I've always treated it, almost always, as a savings vehicle, not as a speculative vehicle. Although, if I want to speculate, I speculate in mining stocks, which are a leveraged way of playing gold and silver, the most volatile class of securities on the planet, actually. And I understand that a lot of people today have Robinhood accounts and are speculating in the stock market,
Sure.
desperately trying to stay ahead of currency debasement and somehow build a nest egg for themselves by speculating in the market. Generally, that's not a good formula for success. You're playing against, extremely smart and well-capitalized and knowledgeable big boys. And the fact that everybody's doing it is also in itself a tip-off to the fact the stock market could be at the tippy top right now. I kind of think it is. There's a bubble in the tech stocks. It's tough, Keith. There's not a lot of places to run and hide at this point.
Price to earnings ratios are really bloated in the S&P 500. I'd love to get your thought on this, Doug. If a person can get a 30-year mortgage rate for a rental property where the rent income meets or exceeds the expenses at a mortgage rate between 6 and 7%, should they do that?
Look, if you can cover your mortgage, a fixed interest rate mortgage, 30 years, one thing that you can almost plan your life around is that dollar is going to lose value every year. So the actual value of your debt, your mortgage, is going to go down every year.
Right.
And presumably the rent that you can charge on your house is going to go up every year. So, yep, doing it the way I think you're doing it is an excellent plan for slow and steady long-term success. Yeah, it makes sense. You're right.
We actually have some listener questions on the thing that you brought up, which I call inflation profiting, when you borrow long-term fixed interest rate debt and get to pay it back with more plentiful dollars down the road. some people don't understand what you just explained. One way I brought it up with my listeners is, well, just look back 30 years ago. In 1995, the average home cost $130K. An 80% loan would be $104K. So here, 30 years later, that median home costs over $400K, and you still just owe $104K on the loan. That's the benefit of what I call inflation profiting on long-term fixed interest rate debt. And of course, your tenant would have paid that down to zero as well. But that kind of makes the benefit be more apparent when we look back into the past 30 years. Well, Doug, as we're winding down here, you have any other thoughts about, just say, the average American out there, what they should do with the Fed behaving and controlling the economy like we do? We're talking about the average American, maybe someone with a mortgage, some rental properties, some savings, maybe a 401k. How do these potential shifts in Fed policy translate into real life consequences and actions for them? Is there anything else?
Well, look, don't count on some outside force to kiss everything and make it better. You've got to look out for number one. And as I said before, the way you do that is you should cut back your expenditures every way you can at this point. And when you cut back your expenditures, save that money. Now, what do you do with the money that you save? It's not as easy making that recommendation as it was a few years ago when I was recommending gold when it was much cheaper than it is now. It's at $4,000 now. Look, save money, get an extra job, earn money, cut back your consumption, learn some new skills, because we don't know how things are going to reorient with the immense advances being made through AI and robotics. That's just generalized advice, but that's all you can do is, well, and buy real assets. Nothing wrong with buying a house the way you're talking about. If you can buy it and the mortgage is cracked with rent, eventually I think we're going to see interest rates go back up to the levels that they were in the early 1980s. People don't remember this, but the U.S. government was paying 15, 18, even 20% for its money. And mortgages were, 15, 16%. It's going to happen again. So I think if you can lock in a mortgage anywhere in here on a good piece of real estate that covers the mortgage, that's simple. It's doable. Everybody should try to do it, in addition to the other things I mentioned.
In 1981, the 30-year fixed rate mortgage peaked at over 18%, to our earlier point about the fact that mortgage rates are actually historically low now, so are Fed funds rates. Well, Doug, tell us one last time about your new book and then any other resources if our audience wants to engage with you.
I do a blog with a number of people at internationalman.com. It's free. So go there to internationalman.com, sign up, and you'll enjoy it. David Stockman, a lot of people will know who he is.
We've had him here on the show twice.
Yeah, well, he writes there for us every week, and we've got great articles. That's number one. Number two, I do a podcast with Matt Smith every week called Doug Casey's Take on youtube.com. Third, I urge everybody to get this book, which talks about if you have a grandchild, a son, it talks about why you should not go to college and what you should do exactly instead of going to college. So that's another thing to do. And we have a newsletter that also covers mining stocks, which is where I'm concentrated in at the moment. They're very cheap, very volatile, and one of the few places in the market, and I hate to say this, that offer the potential of 10 to 1 or more returns in the near future. So I guess those are the areas where you can find out more about me.
Again, the new book from Doug is called The Preparation. It shows a compass on the cover. And then internationalman.com is actually where Doug wrote a piece called The Fed's Quiet War Against the Middle Class, which spawned this very conversation right here. Doug, it's been valuable as always. Thanks so much for coming back onto the show.
My pleasure, Keith. Thank you.
Yeah, real estate is positioned for price stability. I was actually investing directly in real estate through the 2008 global financial crisis, and I know what happened is that people walked away from properties when the economy got rough and they couldn't make their payments. It is almost impossible for that to happen today. Homeowners can make their payments. Look, through Census Bureau data and Realtor.com, we know a couple things here. 4 in 10 homeowners have no mortgage at all. They own the property free and clear. And then among that group with mortgages, 70% of those borrowers still have a mortgage rate locked in at under 5%. Yes, still today. I'll amalgamate those for you. This means that 82% of borrowers either have no mortgage or they have a rate under 5%. So that is really affordable payments along with the protective equity, and inflation can't touch that principal and interest amount. In addition to real estate, Doug Casey is a longtime gold and silver guy. Of course, both of those have soared to fantastic new all-time highs this year. Merry Christmas and happy holidays from me and everyone here at GRE. Next week is another big one. You'll get GRE's home price appreciation forecast for next year to the exact percent. I'm Keith Weinhold. Don't quit your daydream.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.
The preceding program was brought to you by your home for wealth building, GetRichEducation.com.